Today, we're turning our attention to something that sits at the intersection between forensic science and archaeology: bog bodies. Bog bodies bring us face to face with the past, often in unsettling detail. Preserved in the peatlands of Europe, these remains allow us to see the skin, hair, and sometimes even the final expressions of people who lived thousands of years ago. They have become powerful archaeological evidence, but also raise complex questions. To help unpack this fascinating topic, I am joined by Professor Melanie Giles, a leading archaeologist specialising in European prehistory. Professor Giles's extensive research has significantly contributed to our understanding of Iron Age mortuary practices and the cultural significance of bog bodies. If you haven't come across it yet, her book Face to Face with the Past is well worth a read, especially if you enjoy archaeology with a slight forensic twist. It's a detailed and thoughtful look at how these remains fit into the wider picture of ritual violence and belief in prehistoric Europe. Professor Giles's work not only examines the archaeological aspects of these findings, but also addresses the ethical considerations of displaying human remains in museums, prompting discussions on how we engage with the ancient dead in contemporary settings. I am honoured to welcome Professor Melanie Giles to share her insights on this fascinating subject. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for inviting me.
I was hoping we could start with grounding us in the fundamentals and then we could sort of build up. So what exactly is a bog body and why are they so important to the study of the ancient past?
So bog bodies cover a range of different types of human remains. There are many different types of bogs. There are raised bogs, which form when groundwater is cut off from a body of water and eventually only certain kinds of plants can thrive there, the sphagnum mosses, and this creates a kind of a slow, gradual decay of the plants that form peat. And that creates a kind of domed inland moss, a raised bog. Many mountainous areas, because they're wet and they don't drain particularly well, would have what we call blanket bog. And then we have our fenlands, which are more alkaline environments. The raised bog and the blanket bogs tend to be acidic, and these do get fed by not just rainwater but other sources of water, but it's still an environment where peat begins to grow from the decay of plant matter. So all of these are different kinds of bogs, and they're found in many different areas across northwestern Europe, so places like Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, as far up as Sweden and Norway, Britain and Ireland, of course, and Wales. But there are many other kinds of peatlands elsewhere in the world. Sometimes the peat is buried really deep down under contemporary agricultural land or hiding underneath rainforests. But my specialism is really in the northwestern bogs, particularly the raised bogs.
This immediately asks the question of, okay, so these are great places of preservation. How far back does some of this preservation go?
So the magic of those bogs is that they're cold, they're wet, and in an acidic environment, anything organic that falls into their depths, that settles in that peaty water and gets gradually covered over by the peat, doesn't decay in a normal way. So we get the preservation of things like skin and hair, tissue, and sometimes objects or clothing that have gone in the bog with that individual. That's what makes bog bodies so special. But in our more alkaline bogs, of course, that's a very different environment, and there we tend to see what we call bog skeletons. They're still bog bodies, but they are less well preserved in terms of the flesh and the tissue, so we get better preservation of the bone. And we have bog bodies dating back as early as these peatlands start to form, really Neolithic, late Mesolithic, Neolithic onwards. But they're rare, and they tend to either probably be formal burials in quite a rare, wet place, or they might be accidental deaths. These are often quite dangerous environments to cross, and accidents do happen. And then in a recent study, Roy van Beek and his team in the Netherlands have shown that our latest bog bodies include examples like there's a Luftwaffe pilot who goes down in his plane in a bog in Denmark, and he himself has become, even within 50, 60 years, a kind of bog body. So they really span time, but there is a particular pulse, the first millennium BC to mid-first millennium AD, when we see a steep rise in the number of human remains going into bogs. And there are lots of ideas about why that might be.
So just for those who are hoping that maybe we can go back, I don't know, 50, 60,000 years, there is a cut-off point to when these bogs formed.
Yeah, they are an effect of the Holocene environment, which is creating wetlands as vegetation, recolonises places like Britain and Ireland following the retreat of the ice sheets, and over time wetter places develop, and the vegetation that was once thriving there, perhaps woodland or forest, the root systems of the big trees get waterlogged and they die and they fall. So at the bottom of many of our bogs we would have old woodland, old forestry that has been choked and kind of covered over until only wet-loving plant species like the sphagnum mosses can thrive there, and they are what forms peat.
We know of other kind of preserved bodies. We have like the frozen Inca children, we've got the mummies of the Tarim Basin, and the sort of naturally preserved bodies of Egypt. In what way do these bog bodies differ from those other bodies?
Yeah, so what binds them all in common is that they're this remarkable preservation that normally doesn't happen if a body normally goes into soil. The organic components of our body decay, leaving behind the more solid bits, the skeleton. And that is best in an alkaline environment, because bone, being calcium, is well preserved in that environment. So bog bodies are sometimes quite floppy, the bone may not be as well preserved as we might want it to be. And that would be different to, say, the extreme aridity and cold that has preserved some of those other remains, or extreme heat, like the Egyptian remains, where moisture has been wicked away from the body. So what we have is because it's a wet environment, I guess we have organic, organs, skin, tissue, hair that are less desiccated, and so there are certain types of information that they will contain that we can retrieve archaeologically. So, for example, there's been quite a lot of success with isotope analysis, though the interpretation of that needs care, both from the body itself, things like hair and teeth, but also clothing, and analysing the woolen textiles, for example, that people are sometimes wearing when they go into the bog. But aDNA does not survive well. So unfortunately, bog bodies are one of those sets of remains that so far we have not had luck extracting aDNA from bog bodies, because of the acidic environment. That is bad for aDNA preservation. But also because these bodies are so well preserved, because they're quite iconic, and I think that's led to a kind of respect for those human remains that is perhaps unusual compared with skeletonized remains. Museums are very wary about letting invasive sampling happening. So sometimes we suspect that some remains might preserve some aDNA, but we're not going to get permission to extract that right now. So there are things that we can do. There are things that we can't do for all sorts of reasons, scientific but also ethical.
There's something about bog bodies that's kind of different. It's unique. How do you see the kind of impact that bog bodies have uniquely on archaeological science or the public imagination compared to these kind of other examples that we have of potentially, like we've had mummies, for example. There's something unique about bog bodies.
I think it's something about that magic of of the work that the bog itself has done. With Egyptian mummies, they start off being naturally mummified by the desert, and then that is an effect, a kind of a mortuary process that ancient Egyptians tried to mimic through their own interventions, early embalming techniques. And the bog bodies, that hasn't happened to them. It's the work of the landscape, if you like, this extraordinary wetland landscapes that has stopped time. And that means that sometimes those remains, you can come face to face with them. That was the subtitle of the book. Particularly remains like Cladh Man, who is exceptionally well preserved. There is a magnetism, I think, in looking into the face of somebody who lived 2,000 years ago. And I first encountered the photos of these bog bodies when I was 8 years old. As a child, my father was reading P.V. Glob's Bog Bodies book, and I suddenly realised I was looking at the faces of people who lived in the Iron Age. I'd already become a little bit obsessed with it because I was growing up underneath an Iron Age hill fort, and I realised that these people lived at the same time as the people up on the hill fort behind my house. And I was really enchanted by the possibility that these remains gave us an insight into people's lives and deaths that you couldn't get from any other source. So there is something, I think, that draws us in, that makes us look more closely, care more deeply, as well as their scientific potential to give really rich insights into, for me, Iron Age lives and deaths.
That's fascinating. That goes all the way back to your childhood. How many bog bodies are we talking? And like you said before, there seems to be clusters in terms of the time periods in which there seems to be many of them. Tell me more about...
So there are, I mean, if we count all the bog skeletons, the remains that went into the bog and for a time must have been marvellously preserved, but have ended up, partly because we've been draining the bogs, again, for hundreds of years, there are thousands of remains, thousands of fragments from across that time period. The Iron Age and Roman examples that we know of from northwestern Europe, I think there's probably about 180 examples. So it's still a rare phenomenon, and obviously it's restricted to areas where we have these raised bogs or blanket bogs, and where those remains have been preserved. So there are a much wider number of what we call paper bog bodies, where we have tantalising records in newspapers or letters of correspondence between antiquarians suggesting they had come across a bog body, but those remains were not kept. They were often either reburied in the peat, where an unfortunate peat digger found them as a mark of respect, they disturbed the dead and they must put them back, or they were sometimes buried in a churchyard or a kirkyard. Again, as a mark of respect, to kind of laying to rest of the dead, where people felt that wrong had been done to them, and now was the time to give them a Christian burial. But of course, the moment you take a bog body out of the bog, it starts decaying again. Time starts again. So it's only where we've been able, really from the 1950s onwards, to use techniques, actually some of our earliest bog bodies do go back to the 1880s, 1890s, where wind drying, air drying and desiccation was used, and those tend not to be so well preserved. People started experimenting with a bit of light smoking, all the kind of culinary techniques you would use to store food, basically, and now we would use what we call freeze drying, and then we replace the moisture in the bodies with polyethyl glycol, which kind of reinflates the human remains effectively to recreate the appearance of them when they were found. And that's reasonably stable, but, time is never completely stopped. So it is an ongoing process, and some people might feel that that's a bit of a sleight of hand of conservation. But I in the book, I describe it as a kind of care. This is care for the dead and respect for them and the stories they can tell us.
Of the periods where we have these kind of clusters, where there are many more, is that to do with the potential history of the bogs being drained, like you said before, or is this really reflecting not some filter that's happened later, but really the pattern of deposition over the years?
As far as we can see, it's not just fluke. It is a statistically significant pattern, and I would propose that the reason for that is the late Bronze Age is we see a kind of a downturn in the climate. Things get wetter, peat grows exponentially. I think it's reckoned that about a fifth of productive agricultural land in Denmark goes under the waters, under the peat during that period. And if you live anywhere near a wetland in northern Britain, Scotland, Ireland, where there are a lot of wetlands, you're going to notice that your land is getting increasingly wet. Even places like the Fenlands, the peat is swallowing our Bronze Age field systems. We can see that in places like Cambridgeshire. So you are dealing with changes in your environment where the water is rising, the peat is growing, and that is directly impacting on the kinds of lives that you can lead. And I think that's what leads people to try and intercede with those forces of the land and whatever deities they thought were at work, perhaps. So we see an increase in hoarding behaviour, what I would see as offerings to the wetlands, offerings to the gods, perhaps to hold back the waters or appease them in some way. And this increasingly makes those wetlands places where people are, I think, they're going into them. They're quite rich landscapes. The fenlands are rich in wildfowl, eels, fish. Our raised bogs similarly have, quite peculiar but distinct fauna and flora that include the sphagnum mosses, natural forms of wound dressing, antiseptic, super absorbent. And the other thing people are going into the wetlands for, alongside woodland that they can harvest for basketry and timber, is iron ore. That grows in the bog as precipitate layers of bog ore. So if you live in the Iron Age and you are looking for iron ore and you live near a wetland, you can harvest the raw material to make your tools and your blades and your hinges of gates and anything you need to make iron out of. So these to me, and I think for late Bronze Age, Iron Age people, these are really rich landscapes. But they are growing, they are animate, they are agentic. And that means that you have to deal with them in various ways. And Iron Age communities I would see as what we would call exchange communities. You take something, you give something back. Because if you don't show that kind of thanksgiving or propitiatory action, bad things are going to happen to you. So we see lots of things going into bogs. Cauldrons, weaponry, horse gear, vats of bog butter, textiles, wooden bowls and worn bits of agricultural kit and equipment, bits of chariotry, animal offerings. And I think at the far end of that are the people who end up in the bogs. And there might be a range of scenarios that lie behind why some people end up there.
So what are the most common contexts where you're going to find people in the bog? Are some of them accidental, or are we noticing that there's a substantial amount of these that are to do with sacrificial potentially, or is it violence? Are the items we're finding in the bogs potentially storage, or a way of kind of burying your stuff to come back for, or is this definitely, from what we can tell, some kind of offering? Explain the kind of different contexts of how we're finding stuff.
So I think that every bog body has a unique story, and they do really need teasing apart, because there are a range of different scenarios that we think we now understand. So, for example, one of our late Bronze Age famous bog bodies, though we didn't realise it for a while, is the Cladh Hallan mummy. It's actually a composite human being made out of, I think, 3 different individuals, male and female, old and young. But the main body is older than the other bits that have been added to it, and looks as if it's been stored in a bog for a while. It's got classic kind of peat staining. Yet the body itself, as this composite, I would say ancestral figure, was found underneath the floor of a roundhouse excavated by Mike Parker Pearson and his team in the Outer Hebrides. And that would suggest that they had used the bog with someone who died, who they wanted to kind of effectively curate beyond living memory, to create a kind of ancestral figure. So by the time they create that body to lie underneath a roundhouse and be a kind of guardian figure, I think, spanning generations, that body might be over 100 years old. There might be 3 or 4 generations have come and gone with the knowledge that that body was waiting for the right moment to be retrieved and made into this superhuman, I would say. Now, and I think they know the bog works like that because they are storing things in the bog. So bog butter is one of the substances that we find in vats and cauldrons and beautiful kind of vessels. And from later historic sources, there seems to be a very keen knowledge about the fact that the bog stops time, and if you want to put by a little bit of your dairy wealth for a time of need or dearth, the bog can help you cure that butter. I don't think it's I think it's an acquired taste, shall we say, and it's very easy to create something that's more poisonous than good for your health. But we know it was a way of storing up dairy wealth for a time of risk. And if they know that the bog works like that on butter, and they're digging peat themselves for their hearths, for peat charcoal, for ironworking, they're going to be finding things in the bog that have not decayed. So I think there is quite a strong we would see it as a scientific understanding. I think they know about this magical power of the bog, and they are using it with some bog bodies to that end. With other bog bodies, I think they are, a lot of people draw on the classical sources, which tell us that people who've committed certain kinds of crimes deserve to be buried in the bog. We're not quite sure whether that's the Romans' understanding of it. Oh, they have to be buried in a secret place, a wet place, because that's an ignoble end. But everything we know about the other things that go in the bog suggests that to Iron Age people, these are sacred places. These are places where you meet with the spiritual entities that you think dwell there, and that's the right place to make an offering. So the other texts tell us that there are deliberate sacrifices, either for divination purposes, that you can divine from somebody's death struggles or the manner of their death, or as an offering in their own right. And that seems very barbaric to us. The Romans were horrified by the idea of it, even though they themselves were no strangers to exploiting human life and sacrificing lives for entertainment. I think this is a very different kind of sacrifice. There's a possibility that some of these individuals are self-sacrifices, if that makes sense. So some of them seem to have had a very bad life and be from the lower echelons of society and be on a slow slide into perhaps a violent end, particularly perhaps if they were unproductive or they were unable to participate in society in some way. But some of our bog bodies look as if they're drawn from people who had a very good life, very good diet. They might be physically impressive, beautiful even. And here I think we're looking at people who may have positions of power and responsibility. This is one of the ideas that's come out of work in Ireland around some of their bog bodies. Effectively, these are kingly figures. And, maybe at times of crisis, the king has to die. The king has to make way for a new reign or go as a kind of emissary to talk to the gods at a time of crisis. And that, to me, is interesting in relation to the English bog bodies from our area, from Lancashire, where many of them fall into actually what's the early Roman period, a period of extraordinary turmoil, socio-political crisis here. And so, there's a strong possibility that other bog bodies have been executed. Perhaps they were local leaders who fell foul of Roman rule, or cattle thieves, who had to die and be punished and be made an example of. And each story, each body has its own, pathway that's led up to that moment of being brought to the bog. The common thing is that the bog is the right place to put those human remains, and that is rare. That is not what's normal in the Iron Age, where you are normally exposed to the elements and allowed to dissipate back into some larger pot of fertility and decay back into the earth. So these bodies are exceptional. I think they were exceptional in life, they were exceptional in death, but there's a range of different lives that have led to that moment.
There appears to be in that much more of a duality. So you got like Glob's sort of sacrificial model, which is much more simplistic. These are all kind of human. But then here you're kind of exploring that some of them are sacrificed to the gods, but others might be criminals or fallen foul of the local tribes. Or so there's a much more nuanced kind of story being told. Explain a little bit about how the explanations or the interpretations have moved on since the kind of more simplistic model of these are all kind of human sacrifices, and how the Roman element of that might have played a part in everything that was going on.
So I think Glob's book, The Bog People, which was the book I read as a child, popularised the interpretation of sacrifice, and it was very persuasive. He spun still an engaging and vivid tale of the notion that the bogs were the domain of these goddesses of the worlds of the underworld, and he gave them names drawn from classical kind of sources, and really conjured a very vivid notion of these people giving up their life, whether willingly or not. I think he would have said unwillingly, and that stuck for a long while. Of course, he was working a little bit in the dark. He was a pioneer of the early forensic analysis of those remains. So it's only with new techniques that we're able to tease apart more of the manner of their death, the particular concatenation of wounds and events that have led up to their final demise, which enables us to see some people, it's been quite a theatrical death with a number of people involved, and that tends to suggest a small group violence. And that makes us, compare and contrast that with other kinds of bodies from the Iron Age that have suffered similar fates. So we have many more dryland examples to compare these bog bodies with now, and if we look at the wound patterns, we can see some similarities. We don't suggest that they are necessarily sacrifices. We suggest they're caught up in moments of violence. The difference is some of them end up in formal burials, but our bog bodies, for the communities who live around these wetlands, the bog is the right place to take somebody who's died such a death, I think. But in cases like Lindo Man, the latest work by Henry Chapman would suggest that Lindo Man is led onto the bog, that his death happens there in the deepest part of the bog itself, which suggests some foreknowledge, some planning. Now, whether that is an execution or whether that is an act of violent sacrifice, participatory, some people would say, is that, a prolonged torture of this man? But I think the number of injuries and the trauma suggest a group of people armed with different weapons who know they have to take a life for whatever reason, and it happens as swiftly as possible. The first thing that happens to Lindo Man, as with a number of other bog bodies, is a massive head trauma wound, which in and of itself is fatal, but it would take time for somebody to, undergo they're probably unconscious, but it's a slow bleed, deoxygenation, so they hasten that death with other methods. So I think as our forensic knowledge has increased and our non-invasive techniques to see injuries that were hidden to us in terms of fractures, but also our paleo-environmental knowledge of what they were eating, the life they'd lived in terms of their isotopes, whether they'd had a good diet, whether they had moved into the area recently or had lived there for a long time. All of those little bits of evidence allow us to tell more subtle and nuanced stories. And the radiocarbon dates have really made us put some of these bog bodies, to pull them out of our classic period of sacrifice, the Iron Age, into that early Roman era. So in a place like Manchester, we've got to give them their appropriate historical context, which is when troops were coming and going from forts like Mamucium and the forts in the Peat district, or out in Cheshire, Chester, for example, Lancaster, coming and going as a civil war raged and people fell out with each other and emperors' reigns ended and the walls had to be staffed and troops came and went. This is a time of huge political change on the ground. And we can imagine that some people took advantage of that, worked with the Romans, rose to power. Some people fell foul of them. And so that's the context, I think, for the remains from Lindo Moss and the bog body I work particularly on, Worsley Man.
Talking about Worsley Man as a case study, what did the forensic analysis reveal, and how did this particular bog body have a wider significance on the general study of bog bodies?
So Worsley Man is the boghead who is looked after by Manchester Museum. And I saw him when I came for my interview for the job here, and I was absolutely intrigued because he'd been studied by John Prague and Richard Neve for their facial reconstruction programme. There was an early piece of forensic analysis by Neil Garland. They'd done early histology. Jim Burke, the surgeon who worked on Lindo Man, was involved in that analysis. So I was inheriting a body of research undertaken in the 1990s, which was as good as it could be, right when we were pioneering forensic bog body studies. But of course techniques change. So in terms of new techniques we've been able to use on Worsley Man, the micro-CT scanning and computer tomography that we've done through the NXCT Centre, the National X-ray Computed Tomography Department here in the engineering suite at Manchester University, has enabled us to do the work of 3D scanning and then interrogation of the wounds that he suffered from. We're looking here at a decapitated head. We have the cranium, the mandible, and part of the facial tissue and neck tissue. But as far as we know, that was all that was taken to the bog, probably wrapped in a bag, I would think. So his death had happened elsewhere, but somebody was motivated to bring the decapitated head to the bog. And decapitated heads are often used by Iron Age groups as a form of intimidation and display and trophyism. But we know that even though the Romans say that they're completely against that kind of thing, we have iconography, Roman iconography, that shows that they used it as a trope of intimidation themselves. So there's a tombstone of Insus, the cavalry officer from Lancaster, what we call a rider figure, memorial to him as he died in service, and he is shown brandishing a recently decapitated head, swinging it by its hair from his hand. And we've got to remember that many of the auxiliaries serving in the forts up here, they weren't Italians, they weren't true Romans. These auxiliaries were brought in from Germany, Gaul. They were descendants of Iron Age tribes who had their own particular ideas about violence and intimidation, and they brought that with them. So the Romans don't outlaw that kind of business. It's still a way of humiliating or dealing with trouble. And I think that Worsley Man probably falls foul of some of the political circumstances around the Roman occupation of the north. And his trauma pattern is very similar to Lindo Man. So he has a massive trauma wound to the top of the head, probably delivered by something like an axe. It's very heavy. It's really massive. It causes these subsidiary fractures on the base of the cranium, and that would have been fatal, but slowly so. And then we know he is decapitated, and that's a bit of a messy business. There's a kind of like a first blow and then probably a second blow that catches the front of the left-hand side of his mandible. There were a number of other wounds to the face that we can now rule out from the CT scanning because they are much more ragged in nature, and these are post-depositional. These are happening after the head goes in the bog because it's submerged under feet of water and peat, and that's very heavy, and that does this damage to the remains once they're placed in the bog. So some of the trauma that we thought we were seeing to the front of the face, I think we can rule out, but there's no doubt we can see that he's clenched his jaw so tightly when he was executed. He's damaged his teeth. There are flakes missing off his molars. There was a suggestion of a garrote, rather like Lindo Man, but we've been able to do the histological analysis and working with Mike Buckley, the proteomics analysis, that's proved that that's just simply a bit of his own neck tissue, so the sinew of the neck, not a foreign object in the neck. So lots of interesting insights into the manner of his death. I think this is a violent, killing and decapitation, and perhaps the head was briefly brandished or on display, or perhaps the people who cared for him wrapped it up. It must have been quite quick after death, so he's not been put on a pole or displayed to shock people. That has been gathered and I think brought to a sacred place, the Astley Moss complex, a place of great meaning to those local communities and an appropriate place to put a head who, I think Iron Age people were very mindful that people who died sudden and violent deaths, maybe they weren't going to lie quietly in the ground, and so concerns around their revenancy or their post-mortem agency might lead people to bring that most animate bit of the body, the head, to a sacred place to kind of control it, put it in the care of the gods. So that to me is the interesting bit of the story, that even though he dies during effectively the Roman occupation, the Roman conquest of the north, the ritual that is performed after his death speaks of deep-seated indigenous, Iron Age beliefs.
Do we find more heads, or do we find general body parts? Is there a kind of pattern to the kind of things we find?
It really depends on which bit of Britain you're in. I'm an expert on Iron Age Britain, really. So if you're in Wessex, the appropriate place to put those people who've died a violent death or an unusual death or special people is the bottom of a storage pit. And again, I think there's something in common there with the bog, something about a deep place, subterranean, that does that magic work of preserving for them their seed grain. that's a special and potent place to bring human body parts, sometimes whole bodies, but that's rare. And yes, we see a disproportionate emphasis upon heads, but there also they have a very strong fascination for semi-articulated body parts, pelvic girdles, limbs. They're very fond of the right thigh bone for reasons we don't quite understand. So each region has its own peculiarity. We know people are making things out of heads in the Iron Age: bowls, combs, spindle whorls, amulets, and that might not just be trophyism. I'm going to drink out of the skull cup made out of my enemy. It might be I am going to weave with a spindle whorl made out of my great grandmother's cranium, because she's not gone, she's with me, and is that the skill and the presence and and her stories passing on into others' hands. So heads are a bit of a thing, but Inarm has done a fantastic study of what can sometimes be called head hunting, and pulled that apart and really said that again there are different explanations for an obsession with heads, and very often it's not around the gruesome trophyism. It's around the fact that the head is a way of reaping the vitality or fertility of somebody's being. And so possession of that and the act of taking that, it has deeper meanings and consequences for Iron Age people than I think we often imagine.
So you've really mentioned quite diverse practices. In Ireland, you've got kind of these kingly figures going in, and then in different parts of the country, different ways and different things. What's the most striking differences you might find between bog body sites that you've been involved in?
I think I've been very interested in the work of some of my colleagues in places like Sweden, where they've been really working hard on the bog skeletal material, because they're often dismissed as non-bog bodies, and conceptually they've tried to make us see those stories differently, that these people too went into a wet place. So all the intent behind that may have been to I don't think people ever imagined they were creating a bog body. That's a phenomenon that we have created through trying to describe what comes out of the bog to us. But they were taken to these wet places, and they were just as meaningful as our other bog bodies. And they can tell different stories. Some of them, we have cremations, bog cremations as well. And so some of the really exciting work is going on there to kind of resurrect those stories from cold cases, effectively. But some of the most remarkable remains to come out of bogs recently include the Irish remains, Cloney Cavan Man, Old Croghan Man, and now really just a recent discovery in Northern Ireland, Ballymacombe's Moor woman, who's found from the neighbouring townland to where Seamus Heaney grew up. And listeners to your podcast will know of, well, perhaps they will have come to the phenomenon of bog bodies through Seamus Heaney's poetry cycle. And so to actually find an Iron Age bog body, such a short distance from his home parish, his townland, is really extraordinary. And as they say, that's not my story to tell. So the analysis for that is all ongoing. It's going to be extremely exciting. It's being done in a very respectful and sensitive manner by the National Museum in Belfast and teams at Queen's University, Eileen Murphy, for example. And they're really trying to look not just at the life and death of this woman, but the environment of the bog itself. And she was buried with quite a special object that is going to really help us understand a lot more about plant textiles in the past. So that is, extraordinary research that I am keeping my eye closely on, and delighted to be a little bit involved on the periphery, that is going to shed new light on this phenomenon.
What kind of scientific techniques now are changing how we analyse bog bodies? When something comes out of the ground, how are the techniques changing?
So I think because we've created this phenomenon of bog body, it's an archaeological concept. It's a way of singling out a certain category of human remains and giving them a kind of special status. And that means that they're subject probably to more care than almost any other sets of human remains. And people are very nervous about doing invasive work on them, quite rightly so. all archaeology is unique and fragile and finite. And yet, from my perspective, there's no point in doing the work that we do unless we can help tell better stories about those people and their past and the world they lived in. And that's a wider question about why we do that, but I think it really, really matters. So new non-invasive techniques that we can use include, this micro X-ray CT scanning to look at trauma wounds and aspects of injury and disease that might be hidden within the remains that, we can't take the flesh off the bones. We need to preserve those bodies as they are. It can also give us insights into old conservation techniques that people were using and didn't write down. So there's a lot we can gain from those kind of non-invasive scanning technologies. And then we can use minimally invasive techniques to do, I know proteomics is being tried as a method of getting at aDNA instead of, a deeper kind of sample that might be required from, a tooth or the cranium. Isotope work on hair, teeth, and as we're saying, textiles or other objects that are interred with the bodies. That's enabling us to look at things like diet and mobility. Again, some bog bodies are better than others in terms of the damage the acidic environment has done. So in some bog bodies that's just not going to be possible, but these are the kinds of techniques that I'm very excited about. And very simple techniques like really detailed microscopic analysis of the objects found with them, and using X-ray diffraction and X-ray fluorescence in relation to materials analysis. We don't have many bog bodies buried with things, but we have lots of other things that go into bogs. And so the study of bog bodies has to, I think, include the objects that were also thrown into those wetlands, and they're part of that story. So lots of exciting new scientific techniques that do minimal damage, that can help us really gain better insights into their life and death.
The techniques you mentioned there sort of bleed into the obvious ethical questions. And the ethical questions involving bog bodies are about the dignity we owe to the dead. But there's something unique, because if we just find bones, there doesn't seem to be the same kind of reaction to the ethical dilemma that we have, and we seem to be much more comfortable doing a lot of different things. But suddenly when they've got a little bit of soft tissue, it changes everything. Is that more about us and the ethical dilemma of how it feels to us, or is this more about the bodies of the past and how and why would we treat them differently from bones from the past, etc.?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think when a body has been, in one sense, transformed and changed and become bones, there is a kind of, we can recognise the shift that has happened from life to death. It makes it, in some ways, easier to deal with, but also they are less human-like in some way. We recognise them as human, and they can still move us, but we recognise the distance between that process, the process of time and the process of loss and death. With bog bodies and other well-preserved remains, they are more easily recognisably human, and I think therein lies their power, their magnetism, their ability to make them care for us and to be concerned with their lives. But there is also, for some people, a deep-seated sense of discomfort, of even horror, or that these are things that we shouldn't be seeing because they look too forensic. And so we now live in a world where, these are things that we shouldn't see. They are, covered in white tents and dealt with by forensic specialists or mortuary technicians or funeral directors, and we are distant from them. And I think that is a problem of our making and our distance from death. And whether we display such remains or not, I think is a more tricky question. I think it, certainly my work with the Manchester Museum and the last time Lindo Man came north in 2008, 2009, there were lots of discussions around whether the body should be shown. None of the advertising, for example, none of the advertising material showed his remains at all. You had to choose to go into that exhibition to see him. You had a fairly good knowledge of what you were going to see. People were warned, and that has been taken, in a very serious way by museums like National Museum in Ireland in Dublin, where to visit one of the bog bodies you have to enter the little alcove that they've created for each bog body as a kind of a special, quiet, intimate place where the remains are displayed. So, giving people active choice over this, warning them, I think is good, because it gets around that potentially unsettling effect, and people have agency in choosing what they do and don't see. But I would not want to see these human remains, skeletal or well preserved, disappear from our museums, because we don't do death well. We are so distant from it, from the actual physicality of it, but it's the one feature that binds us in common in terms of humanity and existence. And now it's creating real problems with how we deal with bereavement and loss. People from the past have the potential to open our eyes to different belief systems, different ways of dealing with the fact of death, and also what happens to the body in the aftermath. And we may feel discomforted by those conversations now as adults, but once upon a time as children we were quite curious, and we absorbed that knowledge, and it intrigued us, and it wasn't something to be scared of. It was something to learn about, because that was part of what life was. And I'd like to see more of those conversations, not less. And I'd like to use museums more as a place in which such discussions happen and get unfolded, and different beliefs are you're exposed to different ideas around life and whether death is an end or it's not, and if so, how we commemorate the dead. So I think all of our human remains in museum collections have the potential to be ambassadors from the past that help us talk more about our own mortality. Not everyone shares that view, and I understand that that some people feel very differently about that. Some people believe passionately these remains should be reburied, and I want to draw a very clear distinction here between remains that are from British prehistoric contexts, for example, and those that might have been acquired through colonial collecting. That is a completely different matter, where we do find ourselves with supposed care for remains that should never have left where they came from. But with somebody like Worsley Man or Lindo Man, they can't go back into the bog because the bog doesn't exist anymore. We took the bog away. We cut the peat away. We spread it on our garden. We put it in our stables for our horses, and we made it into wound dressings for our soldiers at the front. So they can't simply go back. There's nothing to go back into. Which means that, like it or not, we do have a duty of care for them. The question is, how do we care for them? How do we make the most of their potential sacrifice? How do they live on again in our storytelling? I know that Iron Age people were doing everything you can think of under the sun with the body. They were making things out of bodies. They were pulling them apart, burying them in different places. Some of them they were burying with extraordinary grave goods. I see the museum as another kind of place of memorial and of a celebration of their life. And I personally want to understand lives that were very different to my own. I want to understand the long-term history of diseases. I don't want to shy away from the fact that some of these people died violent deaths. I think they deserve their story to be told because some of them were robbed of their own ability to do that. So I suppose ethically, I would still support the display of such remains in a very sensitive and respectful manner within a museum context. And we'll wait to see how that discussion unfolds over the future.
Wow, this opens a fascinating world for anyone who's new to it, and all sorts of questions about life, death, memory, and connections with the past. So thank you so much, Professor Melanie Giles, for joining us and bringing these ancient people and stories back into view and for another audience and generation. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Will, for the opportunity to have a good chat. Thanks.